Delaying the proceeding now, may I now hand over the floor to Mr. Sumanta Chaudhary, sir.
China and of course the international trading environment. I don't intend to give a long sort of thing, but I think it's good to remember a couple of facts just to place the topic in perspective. First, in terms of the multilateral trading system, the fact is that India is a founder member of the GATT and the WTO, while, as you know, China acceded to the WTO in the Doha ministerial meeting in 2001, and that obviously has certain implications. As you know, as an acceding member, you pay quote-unquote a price for accession, and the price is that the level of commitments that acceding members normally are forced to give is very much more than what existing members might have given. And particularly since the Doha round of multilateral negotiations has got stalled, you have not had any market access liberalization since the Uruguay round got completed in 1994, which is exactly 2 decades. This also means that because China has already taken far more liberalization commitments as a process of its accession, the level of sacrifice that China may be required to make in a round, if it happens at this stage, would possibly be lower than so-called other emerging economies like India, Brazil and South Africa. And while this is something that does not come out in the open, I think it is an important fact to remember when you look at the way different countries react to what is on the table. And I mention this because this is a very, very important fact and might actually play a role in the recently revived Doha talks at Bali, where, as you know, the post-Bali work program includes a work program on the remaining part of the Doha agenda, and it remains to be seen the kind of positions, nuanced at times, that has been taken. Till the around 10 or 11 years, China has maintained a fairly low profile in the negotiation. So this is one aspect. Now, the other side, of course, is comparisons, of course, are not always, I think, called for, but it's important also to look at a couple of macro parameters of basic similarities and differences. And the greatest similarity, of course, is you're talking of the two most populous countries on this globe. And in terms of demographic dividend, China is already, and India, of course, both are reaping demographic dividend. The only difference is that the China's demographic dividend is likely to get diluted to a large extent in another decade, or by 2020, while India's demographic dividend continues much later thereafter. But obviously the problems of large population, and with it the importance of domestic markets and the importance of size to other trading partners, this is obviously a commonality that binds India and China together, and this is something you might remember. But on the trade front then, there are huge differences, and you know that China now is the largest sort of exporter. It has huge trade surpluses, it has huge foreign exchange reserves, and it has a system whereby you know that a large part of the investment is done by the state. And the fact that they have huge foreign exchange reserves means they have sovereign wealth funds, both openly and maybe slightly less discreet, which have the ability to mop up and acquire resources all across the globe, whether it be in Africa, whether it be in Latin America, and so on. And this is what has happened. Now, India has, on the other hand, a fairly large trade deficit and a current account deficit, and of course just about manageable foreign exchange reserves, which naturally puts India in a far more difficult position as far as management of foreign exchange and the ability to use these reserves and so on for external investment. That's why outward investment in India is virtually almost entirely private sector driven. There is very little outward investment except through some of the PSUs as part of their commercial ventures. So this is another big difference that is important. In terms of our own bilateral trade, I don't want to bore you with figures and so on. Suffice it to say that you have a large trade imbalance with China. And in terms of engagement with the region, most of you are aware that as far as the whole of Asia is concerned, in fact, probably the only country with which we do not have some kind of preferential engagement is China. With virtually everybody else in Asia, we have some kind of either an FTA, PTA, etc. Though of course, you might equally be aware that at present you have what are called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Negotiations, which include ASEAN and its 6 dialogue partners, which is India, China, Japan, Korea, Australia and New Zealand. And these 16 countries are presently engaged in negotiating a comprehensive economic partnership agreement for regional integration, and this obviously includes India and China. So as part of that process, obviously preferences would be exchanged between the group, and there would be greater regional economic integration, including between India and China. So this is a third factor that needs to be kept in mind. And I'll just mention one more because that has a bearing on, and I'm sure that would get covered, on the issues in the WTO. Let me just take one or two examples. The WTO dispute settlement system, which is very often the cornerstone of the WTO system. And if the Doha round doesn't succeed, unfortunately, probably the only thing maybe apart from trade facilitation that might still be working. But if you look at how India and China have used the WTO dispute settlement, particularly since the Uruguay round came into existence. Remember that China's experience is only 13 years, while ours is of course much, much longer. But if you look at the disputes that have happened involving India and China, at the back of one's mind, I think the number of disputes in which India and China have been respondents are more or less the same, even though we are speaking of one with 13 years and another with huge amount of years of joining the WTO in earlier GATT days. And similarly, I think the number of cases where we have filed cases, India has filed far more, I think around 21 or 22, and I think China is somewhere around 12 or so, if my memory serves me. But the point that I'm trying to make is that obviously both of them are major users of the WTO dispute settlement system. And not surprisingly, being two of the fastest growing economies in the world, having two of the largest markets in the world, obviously other countries would be looking at your market, and if they feel there is a measure or a policy which is incompatible with your obligations, they would try and drag you to the WTO dispute settlement system. And similarly, India particularly has also, I think, very successfully used the WTO system whenever some of its trading partners had violated their obligations or nullified or impaired their obligations under the WTO dispute settlement system. So I'll just end here. I thought it was important to maybe put some of these facts in perspective, but I'm sure that the speakers and the panel that we have here today would address some of these issues. I will now, I think, invite the panelists to we will start off, of course, with Professor Manoj Pant, who is Professor, School of International Studies, JNU, New Delhi. He is graduated from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University, and MA from the Delhi School of Economics, and his PhD from the Southern Methodist University, Dallas, Texas, USA. And he has previously taught economics, been a guest lecturer at IIM, Lucknow, IIFT, and of course written large number of books and publications. So, Professor Pant, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sumant. Well, actually, how much time do I have, by the way? You know, we guys can speak for the whole day.
Yeah, I think
That's
we are
what we're
supposed
trained.
to end at around 12:30.
So roughly how much time do I have?
And we have now, I think, five speakers. So we have, I think, and we should leave around at least 20 minutes for.
Certainly.
So certainly we should try and finish off by 12:10, which would give us 1.5 hours for the 5 speakers.
Okay, that's...
So 90 minutes divided by 5, just to be fair, is 18, if I'm absolutely accurate.
Okay.
But maybe the first mover has the advantage, so you can
No.
go up to 20 or 22.
We are used to this. We are used to chairman. These are nice, nice, familiar. These are nice, mutually reinforcing surroundings. In our surroundings, the chairman actually cut us off in mid-sentence too. So we're quite used to that. Okay, what I'll do is I have a presentation. It's something I presented just recently last month to the Ministry of Finance at a conference on this in WTO at Tokyo. And I think what I'll do is I'm sure everyone's going to speak about the problems with China and the 2016 when the accession starts biting, what do they do and how do they ensure transparency. I won't go into that. I'm sure there are others, Shishir is here, others are here, who will speak about India and the WTO. What I will do is I'll try to go a little forward and talk about something which others may or may not talk about, and that is the issue of RTAs. And I will go into 2 parts. The first I don't have time for really. I'll come back to if anyone wants. Can someone switch on that thing? I gave you that PowerPoint. And there are 2 parts to this presentation. I'm going to concentrate on the second part. The first part is something I've been writing extensively on for the last 5 or 6 years. I've never understood why do developing countries contact RTAs in the first instance. And the usual information or the usual answer I'm given is, well, the WTO process is not working and therefore everyone is, contracting RTAs. Then the question is, therefore, what is it that developing countries expect to get from RTAs? Just keep carrying forward. What do developing countries expect to get from RTAs which they are not getting from WTO? Now remember, the traditional WTO architecture, its principal gain is supposed to come from tariff reductions. It goes back to theory which I won't get into, that you have to come together and agree on tariff cutting because it will never pay a country on its own to do a unilateral tariff reduction. So I won't go to the theory part, but you are supposed to have tariff reductions. But the largest numbers, please go forward. I won't go into all this. But the largest growth of RTAs, the fastest growth of RTAs has been in the 90s. At this time, actually, barring South Asia and some countries, small countries in Africa, most countries have already cut their tariffs to very low level. So the expected gains from tariff cutting are obviously very low. So that doesn't seem to explain to me why developing countries actually go into RTAs. Now keep going further. Next. Keep going. This is all theory. Let's leave this. Take too long. Look at the evidence. The evidence. Back one. The evidence. Whichever model. Don't worry about the diagram, the reference to the CG and all. Just whatever kind of modeling you do. The actual gains from RTAs is extremely limited. I'm going to refer to you that one study which I mentioned over there, which is those interested can read the Journal of Economic Integration. India, for example, was desperate to get into ASEAN because they said we will have trade diversion, we must get in. And the study shows that actually the RTA did nothing to improve India's trade. I'm talking about standard trade in commodities, not services. Now, why then do developing countries contract RTAs? Because the evidence is overwhelming that there are really no... And let me use the next slide. Next one, please. Sorry, someone's going to have to hang on there because... Oh, is this... How does it work?
Change the slide from this thing.
Oh, okay, great. Oh, okay, went back. Yeah, this slide, I don't know if you can clear. What I've done is a very simple exercise which doesn't require any mathematics or economics to understand. What you do is take a whole lot of RTAs. Mercosur, which of course is the customs union, NAFTA, ASEAN, GCC, Gulf, SAARC, and of course EU. And you look at the total trade of this organization, of this RTA, 1 or 2 years before and 1 or 2 years after, and see is there any change. Actually, I've taken 2-3 years later and 2-3 years later, and actually turns out, barring Mercosur, there is no change in trade. And there is now some empirical evidence which shows that actually RTAs are endogenous, means RTAs don't drive trade, trade drives RTAs. So if a set of countries have already engaged a lot in trade, they say now let's form an RTA. Why? Because we can go further in cooperation. Now what is the cooperation that we need? Next slide. What is the kind of cooperation? I think India has been quite good in this. Oh, sorry, I keep forgetting I have to do this. Okay. Okay. Look at this second evidence. The only RTA that seems to work. Now what people do is they say, we are an RTA with ASEAN, let's say in 2002, 2003. Look, today we trade so much. But as we as economists says, how do you know that trade was not something that happened anyway, and what did RTA have to do with it? So econometricians have learned to deal with this ceteris paribus. Still we find the RTA in per se does not help. Now look at the second evidence, which is quite interesting. This is an ADB study of Asian countries. They looked at traders. What is an RTA? It gives preferential access to your goods in other RTA member countries. What should it do? It should give some tariff advantage to your traders as compared to traders who are outside the set of countries. You look at the survey which the ADB did, and a whole lot of other stuff is all mentioned there. Actually, most traders don't use the RTA route, because they say it's such a headache. By the time you figure out whether it's wholly produced or not produced, whether there is a tariff change heading to use, or whether you use cumulation, should I use regional cumulation? It's not worth the effort. Tariffs are going down anyway. It's better to go the normal trade route. They don't even use it. And I said, not my evidence, not for India. I don't have for India. This for India, Singapore, Thailand, traders, Singapore, Thailand. This is also other references. Now, so my point here is justification for RT, and there's nothing wrong with that. See, you've got to be very careful with the economists. You ask them to study something and they'll tell you why you cannot study it without economists being around. That's a very dangerous thing. So what actually happens is RTAs seem to be, to me, a way by which countries are getting together for political gains. Nothing wrong with that. Remember, economics has always been a study of trade and political economy. There is no question of study of economics without politics. Every single economic theory I know, except barring a few esoteric issues, comes from some political issues. The Hexcholen trade theorem came from political issue. The Ricardian trade theorem came from the Corn laws. So they all come from policy and trade issues. So they seem to be forming coalitions. Why are they forming coalitions? Because single running of RTAs, and this is going to have a bearing on the next part, single person driven trade organizations do not work, whether it's WTO or climate change or whatever. Countries today are very different from what they were in the 30s and 40s. There were very few countries in the 30s. There was the exponential growth of countries after the 1940s with independence and so on. So countries don't know which way international climate negotiations are going to take. Trade is one. It's the only mandatory international organization. I'm sure climate change will be one soon. Where do we go? What do we do? And these smaller countries in particular need to get into small groupings, and you're already trading amongst yourselves. You already know each other. You know what each of you buy and sell to each other. Let's get into organizations which will help us in terms of negotiating international regimes. I see nothing wrong with that, and I don't see a problem. But that really is why I think RT is there. The country which doesn't seem to have understood that yet is the Indian government. Now, take for example SAARC. Everywhere I go, people tell me SAARC is a failed. The most successful RTA from my personal view, from India, has been SAARC. SARC has done more and will do more for diffusing political tension in the subcontinent than any other kind of agreement that you may have had. I can go on endless into how much loss India suffered in the Sri Lankan agreement, how much loss they suffered in the agreement with Nepal, what we are negotiating with Bangladesh. Now I'm quite involved in the Indo-Pakistan trade agreement. Again, the same issues. Actually, it's fascinating how much greater trade with India does for politics in these countries. Just to give you a small thing, we've heard in the Indian elections about the Pakistan issue number plates, right? I happened to be in Pakistan in the Pakistan election. Not a single reference to India by any politician in any TV or mass media, not a single reference. I hear more about Pakistan, India and India than I hear in Pakistan, which sounds quite strange. Now look, East policy, for example, is one which said India must trade more with the East Asian countries, and then we have this ASEAN, Singapore. Again, you see, why have we got no trade benefits? Let me quickly go on from that to the next part of my. The trade benefits are because we have perceived these RTAs in the traditional way. You get together, agree on tariff cutting, we say in the next 10 years, this is the early harvest, over the next 5 years I will cut so many tariffs and so on. But these countries you're negotiating with, South Korea, Japan, even the ASEAN countries, their tariffs are already down to the lowest levels. So you are not going to get any tariff benefits. So it's not surprising that the Singapore agreement has led to greater increase in India's trade deficit, because they are going to gain because you are the ones with the high tariffs. They are not the ones with the high tariffs. Secondly, in the ASEAN, you can see what would any person have done? Said, if I'm going to negotiate an RTA, today RTAs are not about tariffs. That's the first thing to learn. RTAs are not about benefits to tariffs. That you will see when I come to the mega RTAs next. They are about much greater gains than just tariff cutting. Now, minute you look at ASEAN, minute India tried to take the ASEAN RTA beyond into services, everyone disappeared. Same thing is going to happen in South Korea. They're going to say, how are we going to negotiate MRAs? Sorry, being technical, this is a technical subject, WTO. How do we have these mutual recognition agreements? It will take time to work it out. It involves domestic legislation, but one always knew that. We always knew that negotiating any agreement on services will have to involve things like MRAs and understanding regulatory regimes within countries. Tariffs are border issues. Services are internal regulatory issues. Now, having got into this, you can see none of them really want to move. And last point before I come to the mega RTAs. I have 10 minutes more, Sumant?
Yeah, I mean, slightly less.
Okay, 9.5. Okay. So, what the next issue which I want to point out is, having done that, look at the structure of India's trade. I'm not going to get into the manufacturing versus service debate at the moment. That's a completely different macro debate. The point is, the dominant part of your trade is services, not IT. You know, this IT thing is completely blown out of proportion, I think, by these industry houses. It is not the most important part of your trade, but the other services. Many of these are small services like construction, tourism. Now, tourism, inflow of remittances still remains your biggest thing, only direction has changed. Now, remittances from the West are becoming larger than from the Middle East, but it still remains your largest source of foreign exchange and trade. So, I'm saying that given the nature of your economy, why do I get into agreements which don't have a strong services chapter? If they don't want it, don't do it. It doesn't help you. Next. I'm going to make a statement here. Those who want to, I'll give you any number of references to read that. It's very interesting that we, not just we, I think most countries, don't understand that trade and FDI are not two different things. As we teach in the university, FDI is another way of doing trade. I can either sell something to you, or I can license the production of that commodity to you, or I can come to your country, set up a production item and sell something. The bottom line is the same. Everyone wants to either buy an input from somewhere or sell a commodity to some country. Whether you do it through the what's called arm's length trade route or whether you do it through foreign direct investment doesn't matter. So FDI is simply a package of services, commodities, and managerial experience, and trade is simply commodity. That's all. There's no difference. Unfortunately, so in any case, if you want to see those who are empirically oriented, show me any case of any two countries which have a high amount of trade between them. I'll give you one example, it's not true. And there's no FDI, no high bilateral FDI. In general, high trade over time, high growing trade, bilateral trade, is always accompanied by growing bilateral FDI. What are the exceptions? Can anyone tell me what the exceptions are? There's some students at the back, right? Can you tell me what the exceptions to this are for the Indian case? Mauritius, right? So we know that therefore this is not real trade. We know there's some hera-fairy going on. The government's known for the last 20 years they can't do anything about it. So we know this Mauritius-Indian trade is not trade as we traditionally look at. Nor is Mauritian-Indian FDI which is driven by trade considerations. The other example is China. Largest bilateral trade, India's deficit with China is more than our trade with most of the Western countries. Yet why don't we have FDI? Again, you know the answers. But the point is, in the long run, you cannot drive trade without having a proper FDI regime in place. And that's the problem that we have, that FDI is something which some other division looks after. But the real guys who know what's happening externally are the commerce guys. But the commerce guys are supposed to look only after the trade part. For that, we have to go to DIPP, which is on the wing, and let's not get it. But the point is that to separate these two as two distinct issues, everyone agrees that we should have more trade, but they don't seem to agree that we should have more FDI. All I'm arguing is the second one doesn't make any sense. And these two cannot be separate. Now let me quickly jump to the point I was trying to make. What's coming up ahead? These are all data. These two mega RTAs. Let me explain this in 2 minutes. There are two things being negotiated since about 2013. Well, it began earlier, but since 2013 actual negotiation. One is called the TTIP, Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership. And the other is called the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. Okay, so Pacific countries, which is really the East Asian countries, plus Russia, USA, and of course there is someone just mentioned, it's basically the ASEAN countries plus all the others, including New Zealand, Australia, and so on and so forth, basically the Asian part. It's really a development of the APEC. And TTIP is a US-EU partnership. So TTIP is really not open to the others, it's a closed shop. You know, basically these two countries working out how we can form the first big mega RTA between the EU and the US. The common element of both is the USA, and the common exclusion, I'm not talking about RCEP, common exclusion from what I know is China. Now I'll come to that a little later. Now, what are the two agreements trying to do? They are again going on the same ground that the WTO is falling apart, nothing's happening, although I personally think there's been huge success in WTO. But they say WTO is falling apart, and in any case, America doesn't like this way the WTO is working. There are too many people taking decisions. They're not used to other countries also participating in decision making. So they say, let's start something new. The dominance of USA in this is very clear. As far as I'm aware, most of the TPP agreements, by the way, before I mention to anyone, there is no official statements on TPP. The only information I have is WikiLeaks. Now, since WikiLeaks also overthrows government, let's not ignore their information completely. So that's all I have. TTIP is better documented because they have a working group which keeps issuing what they're doing. But TPP is really just, we are guessing what they could be doing. What is the main agenda? Actually, it's pretty good. They are trying to expand, I've mentioned two things. Expanding WTO agenda to new IP and copyright. There is a feeling that the Doha agreement on TRIPS is not too good. We need to go beyond that. So it's TRIPS, what you might want to call WTO plus agreements are what they are. Very important, and I'm going to mention that, they are bringing in the idea is to bring in all those issues which were Singapore issues, which most countries said at the moment let's not get into, like government procurement, labor standards, environment. Also, in the WTO today, the unfortunate thing from India's point of view is that services is only a positive list approach, which means you can say, I will only negotiate these 3 or 4 areas. You know, it's every time you can keep changing it. In this, at least from what I'm aware, in TTP-IP, USA and all are now, in the TTP-IP, they are at least negotiating services as a negative list, just like anything else. So that seems to be a positive factor. Now, TPP is what I'm more interested in talking about. I'll take 5 minutes once. Okay, let me wrap up. Let me wrap up with the questions then. Okay, what is my problem in these agreements? Okay, general comments. What happens to WTO? Because it's very clear that apart from the secrecy, and no one knows who is allowed to come where. Now, let me try to end by saying that the TPP in the conference in Tokyo, the representative from Tokyo said that these are very important agreements. RCEP should now be expanded to become part of TPP. There are lots of issues in the differences. RCEP has some special differential treatment, which is not there in the TPP and so on. But he said, you know, let's get on. These are fast-moving trains. Let's get on them. And my problem with these kind of statements are, it's okay to tell me it's a fast-moving train, let's get on. But where is the train and where's the station? I have no idea where the station is. I have no idea where the train is. There is no knowledge at all about what is the mandate, what is the agenda of the TPP. Now, this is going to be the next big thing you can see. Where is the attraction for India? It's true, India really can't afford to be out of RTAs where both the US and the EU are included. But the question is, what is it then that could be a positive for India? Really, I think it's the positive list approach to services which seems to be the best thing, and the fact that you have to have a proper investment regime on board. I think these are the 2 positives for India. Then, of course, the question of MRAs, etc., etc. Now, concern really is the secrecy. Now, this is not an anti-US or anti-EU kind of thing. Point is, democracies cannot negotiate agreements in secrecy. Because then what happens is, everyone keeps estimating what they think is happening. One guy says, this is what's going to happen. We are hearing that the new IPR regime will completely overthrow our own regime on health. The system we have, IP protection health. I don't know. But I can't disprove it because I have nothing to disprove it with. So the problem is, when will the TPP actually be known? What are the modalities? And how do we go ahead? And so the question between the Indian government is really between the devil and deep blue sea. What do we do? My own thing is, I think we should stick with the WTO. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pant. And whether we like it or not, every session seems to turn out to be something on RTAs. So in that sense, our next speaker, Professor Henry Gao, is an Associate Professor of Law at the Singapore Management University and the Dongfang Scholar Chair Professor at Shanghai Institute of Foreign Trade. He started his career as the first Chinese lawyer at the WTO Secretariat. Before moving to Singapore in late 2007, he taught law at the University of Hong Kong. He's widely published on issues relating to China and WTO, and his research has featured in CNN, BBC, etc. He has advised many national governments and he sits on the advisory board of the WTO Chairs Program, which was established by the WTO Secretariat in 2009. So I would request Professor Henry Gao, please start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's my pleasure to be here to speak to the Indian audience about my review on China's participation in the WTO. What I'm going to speak today actually is a part of a larger project I'm doing on China's participation in the WTO in general, in which I look into 3 specific areas. That is China's participation in dispute settlement, in WTO negotiations, and also in FTAs. But today, because of time constraints, so I will focus on China's participation in WTO negotiations And hopefully, if we have more time during the Q&A, feel free to ask me questions on discipline settlement of FTAs. Actually, this part of the research will be published in a book published by Cambridge University Press later this year. So as mentioned by Mr. Secretary earlier this morning, China joined the WTO in 2001. When China joined the WTO, a lot of people had a question regarding the possible impact of China's participation in the WTO, because, I mean, China is the 800-pound gorilla in the WTO. So what would the accession of China in the WTO change in the organization? Different people have different views. Some people think that China's participation would now strengthen the developing country bloc and make the WTO a more balanced institution. For those of you who still remember, for example, the debate on the new international economic order, as you know, they have great hopes for China. But on the other hand, some other people think differently. They said, well, if China gets in, because China has been an outsider for so many years, China wasn't really familiar with how things are done in the WTO, and if they take a hardline approach, this could make things more difficult in the WTO. This could upset the status quo power and make it more difficult to reach deals in the WTO, because in the past, you have the US, EU, India, Brazil, everybody know everybody else, so it's easier to reach deals. And now with a new guy entering into the organization, things are going to be more difficult. So how has it turned out? I think we can only answer this question by looking at China's experience in the first 13 years of its membership in the WTO. So if you look at the initial stage, that is for the first 4 years of China's accession, I would argue that China was largely a silent player. I was fortunate to be working in the WTO Secretariat since 2002 when China just joined the WTO, and I actually personally attended some meetings in which the Chinese delegates were there. Typically, what happens in these meetings was that the Chinese delegate would read from pre-prepared statements, prefixed positions that was dictated by the ministry in Beijing. And after they read the statements, if somebody else become curious, they might raise their hands and say, well, this particular point you raised is really interesting, but what about this issue that is related to what you just mentioned? So what are they going to say? The Chinese delegate typically would say, well, that's a very good question, but I can only get back to you later. So they will rarely answer the question on the spot. Instead, they would always refer to a later occasion. So what they will typically do after this is that they will go back and seek further instructions from Beijing, and then they might get back to you at the next meeting if you are lucky. But if you are not lucky, which is the case most of the time, you will never hear from them again. They will just bury the question. So that is typically what happens during the first few years. So why did China take such a low-profile approach in the first few years? I think there are several reasons. The first reason is the so-called the RAM argument. Well, RAM referred to recently acceded members. As alluded to by Mr. Secretary in his opening remarks, when China joined the WTO, as a new member, China had to make many extensive and deep commitments. For example, China agreed to reduce its tariffs on agriculture products to an average of about 15%. And it agreed to reduce its tariff on industrial products to an average of 9%. That is very low. I'm talking about bound rate, not about applied rate. If you look at India's applied rate, for example, for India's tariff on industrial products is more than 30%. That is much higher than China's. That is the bound rate. Of course, India's applied rate is about 10% on average. So China has made a lot of commitments, and this is the case not only with regard to goods, but also with regard to services. For services, China has agreed to open up more than 100 sectors out of the total of 120 sectors, 160 sectors in the WTO classification, and again, that is quite extensive. So China's argument is that we have made so many commitments and you shouldn't expect us to make more commitments in this new round because the new Doha round was launched at the same time when China joined the WTO at the Doha Ministerial Conference. So we just made all these commitments. We need time to digest and to implement these commitments, and you cannot require us to make more commitments. At first, China's argument seems to be quite persuasive with the WTO members. That is why in 2005, when the WTO had the Hong Kong ministerial meeting, actually, if you look at the Hong Kong ministerial declaration, there is one line which says we take into account the difficulties facing the recently acceded members, countries like China, and we understand that they will not be required to make the same level of commitments as other WTO members. But as the Doha round dragged on longer and longer, the Chinese argument started to lose its persuasiveness. Because, I mean, if you look at the situation in 2005, 4 years after China joined the WTO, you could still argue that China's commitments were fresh. But now, in 2014, you already had 13 years passed since China's accession, and China's commitments do not look so fresh anymore. So if you look at the latest negotiating text, they no longer talk about RAM. Instead, they now talk about VRAM, that is very recently acceded members. How do you define VRAM? That is those members which acceded to the WTO after the Doha Ministerial Conference, because China joined the WTO at the Ministerial Conference, so it doesn't qualify as VRAM. So therefore, there's no free ride for China. Second, China lacked expertise on WTO issues. This include lacking expertise on both the substantive rules of the WTO. As you know, the WTO has this book, the final text of the Uyghur Round Agreements, which is about 500 pages, and there are a lot of rules, substantive rules in these agreements, and they are hard to master for a new member. And not only that, China was not familiar with the procedural rules in the WTO. As you know, in the WTO, many deals are actually not done according to the formal procedure. In the formal meetings, they are done, for example, in green room meetings, in the informal group meetings, and so on. And China wasn't familiar with this process either. You might argue that China has participated in the accession negotiation for 15 years. China sought accession to the GATT in 1986. So it has negotiated with other members on its accession for 15 years. So it would have some experience in international trade negotiation. But my answer to that is the WTO accession negotiations is very different from the normal trade negotiation, because accession negotiation is a one-way street. As a new member, you can only respond to the requests, demands made by other members. But in a normal trade negotiation, it's a two-way street. That is, you not only have to deal with your defensive interests, but also have to make demands with regard to your offensive interests. And this China couldn't really learn in its accession negotiation. So because of all these reasons, China was very silent up until 2005, 2006. But at the same time, things started to change in the WTO. As we know, in the WTO, initially, the power concentrated in the hands of the Quad countries, that is US, EU, Canada, and Japan. And later, the power shifted, especially after the Uyghur round, the power shifted to the G4, that is US, EU, India, and Brazil. And again, later, the core group become the fifth, that is the 5 interested parties. In addition to the G4, you also have Australia, which has a keen interest on agriculture, which was a major issue in the WTO. And later, Japan came back, so you have G6. But all along, you did not find China in the core group of the WTO. So where is the elephant, the proverbial elephant in the room? Why didn't China participate as a major member during the early stages in the negotiation? I think there are several reasons. The first reason is because if you look at the initial stage of the Doha negotiation, that is up until 2006, the main issue that they negotiated was agriculture. On agriculture, actually, China doesn't have a strong interest because China doesn't export a lot of agricultural products. China exports about 95% of its exports are in industrial products, and its agricultural exports are minimal. And also, China actually has import a lot of agricultural products. China, for example, on several commodities like soybean, like wheat, like cotton, China is one of the largest and even the largest importer on all these commodities. But on agriculture, the main issue in the first stage of the Doha negotiation was like this. The developing countries demand the developed countries to reduce their subsidies on agricultural products. So if China take a position on agriculture, which position would it take? Well, China probably would side with the developing country because China has made a political decision of siding with the developing country. But if China joined the developing country and indeed the developed country reduced the agriculture subsidy, actually this is bad for China because China now would have to pay more for their agriculture imports. So that is why China actually didn't take a strong position on agriculture. That is also why, even though China was a founding member of G20, which is the main agriculture group in the WTO, but China didn't really stand up as a main advocate of a G20. It is always either India or Brazil speaking on behalf of G20. Also, China, for the first few years, had to deal with all these China-specific provisions. And these include, for example, special safeguard mechanism against Chinese products and non-market economy statutes in anti-dumping investigations. And these provisions actually affect the Chinese export much more than the normal WTO rules because they are tailor-made for China. They are different from the normal rules you find in the WTO anti-dumping and safeguards agreements. And China would like to change these provisions. But they cannot really change these provisions in the normal multilateral trade negotiation because these are tailor-made for China. They are specific to China, and the multilateral trade negotiation would only address the general issues that affect everybody. But in 2007, there was a really interesting development, and since then, China has been kind of pushed onto the center stage of WTO negotiations. Why? Because in 2006, the major powers in the WTO managed to reach a major breakthrough in agriculture. Now the US and EU reduction numbers are much closer to what the Indian and Brazilians are demanding, and the kind of had a deal that was close at hand that they could agree on. And after they agree on agriculture, they then move to the next item on the agenda, which is NAMA, non-agriculture market access, industrial tariffs. So in 2007, the G4, US, EU, India, and Brazil, had a meeting in Potsdam. And at this meeting, the US and EU started to push India and Brazil for making more concessions on industrial products. I mean, the tables have turned. When you negotiate agriculture, the developing countries are the demandors, while the developed countries are the demandees. And when it comes to NAMA, it's the developed countries which are the demandors, and the developing countries are the demandees. So the US and EU said, well, look, your tariffs are too high. You know, India and Brazil, their bound tariff on industrial products are both on average about 30%. So that's very high level compared to the developed countries, which is about 4% on average. So they said, you should reduce your industrial tariff. So what's their reply? The Brazilian minister made a very interesting remark. He said, well, we would be happy to make concessions on industrial tariff, on NAMA, if we could be given policy space against the deindustrialization by China. So what does he mean? He means that if we lower our industrial tariff, all these industrial products from China would flood our market, and our domestic industries would be destroyed. Okay, so why should we open up our industrial market just for China to benefit? Okay, so now, as you can see, even though China still was not in the room, but everybody was talking about China, and the NAMA negotiation cannot really proceed without the involvement of China. So since then, the major powers have tried to push China into the core group of negotiations. And this is especially the case for the US and EU. the US and EU, if you read the news, after 2007, you can see that they started to talk about the possibility for China to become a more responsible member. What does more responsible member mean? Well, it means that you have to make more contribution to the negotiations. And to entice China to become a so-called more responsible member, they employed both carrots and sticks. The carrots is this: they have been, every time they go to Beijing, they will tell the Chinese, look, you are the biggest beneficiary of the multilateral trading system. Look at it, what you have achieved in the past 30 years. And how did you achieve this? Because the WTO helped to reduce tariff, and you benefited from this. So you have the interest in keeping the WTO going. And second, they also had some sticks. What are the sticks? The US in particular has been pressing China to make concessions, deep concessions on sectorials. What are these sectorials? Automobiles, chemicals, machineries, and so on. These are the key sectors which the US has a key export interest, and which the Chinese has a relatively higher tariffs. For example, its tariffs on automobile is 25%, which is quite high considering that China's average tariff is only about 9%. So they try to entice China to join the core group. But by this time around, China also started to take a new approach. China realized that it can no longer tie its economic interests together with its inflexible political position. So instead, it decided to take more practical positions with more flexibility. And this is reflected in China's position on some of the key negotiating issues. For example, on Singapore issues, as we know, the only Singapore issue that is left on the agenda now is trade facilitation. And on trade facilitation, actually, most developing countries are reluctant to negotiate on trade facilitation because they stand to benefit very little from trade facilitation, right? On the one hand, they have to simplify their customers' procedures. They have to buy computers, install all this software, to make processing much simpler. But on the other hand, they don't export that much. So they are not going to benefit from the simplified procedures in other countries. But if you look at China, China stands to benefit a lot from the trade facilitation deal because it not only exports a lot, but also it exports to almost every country in the world. Okay, so of course the Chinese would benefit. So that is why they have been supporting trade facilitation, which is a different position compared to other developed countries. Second, China's another main position in the negotiation is that we are willing to make concessions. But whatever concessions we make must be on par with other developed countries, especially other major developed countries, that is like India or Brazil. That is to say, if you give some break to India or Brazil, you should also be prepared to give those to China. We cannot be picked on alone, okay? That is what the Chinese resent. That is why, for example, in 2008, when they had the July 2008 meeting, the meeting collapsed partly because of the differences between US and EU on the one hand and India and China on the other hand on special safeguard mechanism for agriculture products. Actually, there's one, this is a story that everybody knows. Actually, there's another story that a few people know. That is, after the deal collapsed, the US actually tried to salvage the deal. So USTR Schwab actually went to the Chinese, and she said, if you are prepared to give us more concessions on sectorials, we would still think the deal to be worthwhile to us, and we can go back and tell our people back home that we can conclude a deal. What did the Chinese do? The Chinese said no. Why? Because the US didn't ask India and Brazil to make the same concessions, and the Chinese feel offended, So they were basically saying, whatever commitments, whatever concessions you want us to make, you have to ask everybody else, especially India and Brazil. You cannot just ask alone. So that is why the talks collapsed. And as we can see, China really learned its lessons and now behave in a much more sophisticated way in WTO negotiations. So in conclusion, as we have seen for the past 13 years, China has really emerged from the periphery of WTO negotiations, Doha negotiations, to the center of the negotiations. It now is a member of the G7, the core group in the WTO. It is always a member of the Green Room, of course, but being a member of the G7 is something. But China didn't seek this position on its own volition. Instead, China was kind of forced onto the center stage, was pushed onto the center stage by the major powers, especially the US and EU. Why? Because US and EU realized that if they want to negotiate anything on NAMA or even on services, they wouldn't have a commercially meaningful deal without the involvement of China. So they need to involve China. And personally, I think even though China became a member of the core group only reluctantly, but I think having China in the core group is a very good thing for the multilateral trading system, because this enhances the representativeness and also the legitimacy of the multilateral trading system. Without the involvement of China, you would run the risk that you could conclude a deal between other major powers one day, and then the Chinese would say, well, we don't want to honor the deal because we didn't play a part in concluding the deal. So by involving China, you eliminate that risk, and that is really good for the legitimacy and the stability of the multilateral trading system. But but one last point, I don't think we should make the mistake of turning the so-called Doha round into a China round. Actually, this is a proposal made by several scholars in the US. They wrote an article saying that the Doha round should be now converted into a China round, because their argument is that for the US to make the Doha round worthwhile, they only need concessions from China. They can forget about every other country, and so long as China can make enough concessions, the deal would be worthwhile for the US. But they didn't see the other side of the coin. That is, would China agree to such a deal? There's no way China could agree to such a deal. If you push too far, then China will snap at some point, and this is not very good for the multilateral trading system. So, shukriya, and I will be happy to take any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gao, for tracing, I think, the evolution of China's engagement in the WTO, and having been in Geneva for Professor Gao. That leaves me to move on to the next speaker, who is Dr. Rajesh Chadha, Senior Fellow at the National Council of Applied Economic Research. He has received his PhD in economics from IIFT New Delhi and has taught extensively at institutions including the Hindu College, University of Delhi, and of course NCAR. His work on NCR University of Michigan Computable General Equilibrium Model has been used to analyze the impact of India's trade policy reforms, bilateral agreement studies with China, Japan, and Singapore, and GST issues for the 13th Finance Commission. I would now invite Dr. Chadha to make his presentation. Thank you. I'm fine from here.
You can put the PowerPoint, please.
Top one. No.
I begin by thanking, that's why it says thank you, I don't know why, but thank you very much to the chair. Thanks to General School, CII, for having invited me to this event. From the beginning, please. Thank you. Okay, what I have done is, okay. You see, what I have done is, knowing well that I am going to meet with, I taught all my life, so I'm going to meet young students. I have tried to keep my presentation in a way that we all talk amongst ourselves at many times, but you'll find this slightly simplistic so that the students, I think many of them are the law students, would be able to pick up the issues that the two distinguished previous speakers have already mentioned. Just to mention that I work with very complex general equilibrium models, but I am not going to bring that complexity in my presentation. Secondly, I also want to be clear on that the big agreements that are being discussed are not very new. In fact, what happened, I have 18 minutes, am I right? Yeah, I'll use 17, so because, but I would definitely have 18 to go. You see, just to introduce two or three, many of you might not have done this issue before, so particularly for the students, that you see, the world became multilateral after the US encouraged the European common market way back in 50s, and US became, the world became in a way multilateral only till 1989, when the US realized that it wants to have a bigger role, and hence the CUFTA, Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, and NAFTA were agreed in late 80s, early 90s. However, as you would see, after that, there is a plunge into the issues that are very much discussed. So please note that there is a debate that has been discussed, but I would like to slightly go back and simplify the discussions, that the developed countries can afford the, what is multilateralism versus regionalism has already been discussed. That is, GATT and WTO represent multilateral discipline, whereas the regional trade agreements are more regional in nature, and Jagdish Bhagwati calls these agreements as spaghetti bowls, that there is too much complication, which I will show in my later part of my presentation. I don't want to go into details here, but what I'm saying is that the developing countries have started mimicking what the US, Mexico, and Canada started with way back in 1980s as the first, free trade or, PTA. Please remember that, don't get confused. PTA is preferential trade agreement, FTA is free trade agreement, regional trade agreements all mean nearly the same thing. So please note that when I am saying RTA or PTA, I am talking about the regional part of the global trading system. Again, that's what I have spoken. The multilateralism is accepted as the first best. However, the US took excuse and said that weak functioning would lead to, hence we are going into regionalism. There is a lot of debate. Are the two mutually compatible? Are the two mutually incompatible? However, all that we have heard and we do know, the end result is chaos and confusion. It was way back in early 90s, and it continues to remain even today. Please note that I call this a dinosauric or titanic double cross by EU and the Americas. This is dinosauric double cross, and I am going to the beginning, that the WTO born on January 1, 1995, and Austria, Finland, Sweden joined the EU on January 1, 1995 itself. So expansion takes place right at the same time when the mother of multilateralism is born in January 95. And please recall, many of us forget that there was a summit of Americas in Miami. They talked about the free trade agreement of Americas, that is 34 countries of Americas. So the big trading agreements are not really new. They were in a different format even before. Please note that it did not stop here. It went on. The tentative date for the completion of Doha round, that is still running, was December 2004. But at the same time, we also saw the enlargement of EU from 15 to 25, and FTAA, Free Trade Area of Americas, was to be born in January. So you can see what happened when the WTO was negotiated or started, and when the Doha round was to complete. the big agreements were still being discussed. I also take you back to, as an introduction to 2008, where Pascal Lamy in Geneva gave a statement to kind of shoo away or to say that, what is your problem? The average round takes 7 years. So in 2008, when it was already 7 years, Pascal Lamy, the then Director General, tells us that what is the problem? The problem is that he was wrong, because 1948 to 2008 are, you can count the number of years, maybe 50 years plus. He said he divided the number by 7 or maybe something like that and said that, look, the average age of a trade agreement is probably 8 years or maybe 7 years or whatever, 7 years. However, when I trace back, I see the first 4 rounds took 1 year each. The second round, that these are the rounds of discussion before Doha round, took 2 years. Please note that there is an arithmetic progression of increasing life. A round takes 2 years, then 4 years, then 6 years, then 8 years. I assumed with my small wisdom that the next round may be 10 years. However, we all know that instead of 2004, it's already 2014, and the Doha round, so-called the disciplinary round, has already entered in its teens, but is still to be negotiated. Nothing has happened. Here I would deviate a bit from the general discussion that we have on regionalism versus multilateralism. Please note that there is a famous paper by Richard Baldwin who says that, is WTO relevant today? Obviously, I have question marks on that. But one of the interesting things that has happened, and China and India are seriously concerned about that, China more so, that a lot of trade has become in the form of global supply chains. No more are the days when I produce and sell somewhere. An iPhone, when it is produced in China and exported at $400, Chinese value added probably is $20 to $30, I am told. So China has a problem when you tell them that you export a lot. But they say that, no, there is a lot of imported component when I export an iPhone worth $400. Hence, OECD, China has come up in a big way, has now started, can you, particularly those who are studying it knew, that when components keep shifting from one country to another, these are called global supply chains. I do something on the chip goes somewhere else, from there it goes to China. So the trade gets multiple counted, not only double counting, triple counting, fourth counting, etc. So there is a new model that is now coming up called trade in value added. That it will be better to talk of trade in value added rather than the physical trade, which is counted multiple times. And global supply chains have become an important element. However, there is a mismatch. Global supply chains are not global, they are regional. And there are 3 factories that we talk about: factory Asia, factory North America, and factory Europe. And headquarter economies, I can go only in the question answer session if I'm asked: Japan, US, and Germany. And remember that this is a hub and spoke approach. There are 3 countries which are hubs: Germany in Europe, US in North Americas, and Japan in Asia. These are the countries. So when other countries are exporting, much of the thing that they are exporting has actually been imported as components from these 3 countries. And this is called hub. And now when the global supply chains have come up, the argument around the world is that probably the traditional WTO, which talked about as if something is produced in India and sold elsewhere, or produced in China, sold elsewhere, is much less, has already been diluted in a big way. How effective is WTO? Richard Baldwin has gone to the extent that do we need a WTO 2, which takes into account the issues that China has been very serious on, that the trade in value added should be looked at, because trade in commodities gets multiple counted, and hence the total world trade gets inflated. Please note that the WTO 2013 Bali Ministerial, very recent, they have developed a work program. They said that by the end of 2014, it would be completed. How effective is the traditional WTO? Richard Baldwin calls it. Patrick Lowe has also entered the debate. These are two big names, so please don't go by. You might not have seen the papers, but how effective is the international WTO framework? The role of supply chain trade, it's, as I said, global supply chain word is misleading. These are very, very regional trading systems. WTO may not be able to facilitate what the countries are wanting on the supply chain discipline. Now, what my previous friends have already spoken about, note that these are the mega regional initiatives which Dr. Pant talked, Dr. Gao talked. Mega regional initiatives have been taken. And you can see the first one that Dr. Pant mentioned was the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, where you can see ASEAN, 10 ASEAN countries, plus 6, China, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, New Zealand. So those who would not understand CGKIAN, 6 more countries are joining or almost joined, China, Japan and Korea, India, Australia, New Zealand. However, there are 2 big agreements already in place, TPP and TTIP. Can you see those blue bold countries? What is the problem? The problem is of friction, that Australia, Brunei, Japan, New Zealand, Malaysia, Singapore and Vietnam, they are part of TPP as well as a part of RCEP. So, because many of them are ASEAN countries, and India, Australia, New Zealand, in fact, India is nowhere except in the first one, and China is also not there in TPP and transatlantic. So what I'm saying here is that even though we are told that the world trade is going to walk on 2 legs, WTO and the mega regional trade agreements, there are bound to be frictions, because China is absent from both TPP and TTIP, whereas there is going to be a lot of debate and fight between China and the US. Therefore, once again, it's not as if life is simplified. Life is again complicated here. And I mentioned that RCEP, that is the Asian Trade Agreement, TPP excludes China. TPP includes 7 RCEP countries. So the 7 countries are in both agreements. So frictions are bound to happen. TTIP, as already mentioned, is EU and US, and concerns of China and India are serious. Now, my last 3 or 4 slides, I think I've talked about this, that the US is playing a smart game. It wants a lot of WTO plus elements to come in. Nobody has ever thought that whether the smaller countries would actually be able to implement the way the US is dictating the terms in TPP just to know that we do work on general equilibrium models. I did a study of some Pan-Asia Free Trade Agreement where I thought that South Asia, now this is a hypothetical example I did, or that SAFTA becomes a partner, and then one by one China joins in my simulation, ASEAN joins, ASEAN NI is joined, so I keep moving to a bigger agreement in Asia, and I do see, not taking you through, I do see that now it's the poverty question. The real returns to labor keep increasing no, I'm not going into GDP, welfare, that's a lot of work to report, but if you see the real returns to labor keep increasing, that is wages keep increasing in most of the countries except 1 or 2 outliers. And if the liberalization is done autonomously, that we now liberalize for all the countries, the gains are much higher. What is the way forward? My last slide. I am at my 17th minute. The way forward is the major trading nations see PTAs. PTAs is, preferential trade agreements, FTAs, or plurilateral trade agreements, whatever agreements are away from multilateral agreement. So major trading nations see PTAs to be important for addressing certain special issues. supply chains. So this is an excuse by the US and the EU. I don't mind because a lot of lots of studies have been done. I don't want to go in detail here. Multilateral discipline has its own role to play, lest world trade regime goes haywire. Many matters can be addressed in PTAs, but many matters can be addressed in, particularly if you see the third bullet here, concerns of small economies. In much of the discussion, we ignore the least developed economies. We do discuss sometime in our free time that there should be something duty-free, quota-free scheme. How well it is implemented, I'm not sure. That comes from the multilateral discipline. GATT now has 2 pillars. GATT had 2 pillars, by the way, most favored nation and national treatment. But I am told now the 2 legs are changing. So the 2 legs have become big regional trade agreements. And the last point here is that China and India need to worry. China, because it is a big player in global supply chains or regional supply chains. Global value added is the main concern. For India, I think it's a very serious situation because we have not done things right at home to encourage foreign direct investment, and supply chains almost absent. I think I am on time, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chadha, and particularly for introducing a word that has become, I think, the most fashionable jargon in trade economics these days, which is the global supply chain or the global value chain. Just one point I would like to just highlight here, particularly I think for the young law graduates here, is that the issue of rules of origin. This is a silently forgotten issue. Many of you might not even know that there is a rules of origin agreement in the WTO. For 20 years, that particular committee has been looking at harmonization of rules of origin, and if I can put it, has gone backwards rather than forwards, and it's not going to likely to do anything. That's one of the reasons why RTAs are also better, for a different reason. In the RTA context, you can be far more selective about rules of origin. Now, whether you've gone the right sectoral rules of origin or whether you've gone the right formula, but the important point to note is that the RTAs give you far more flexibility in rules of origin, and that may be one of the reasons why people may be wanting to enter into RTAs. I just thought I'd mention that because that's a very important fact. I move on to the next speaker. Professor Sajal Mathur is a professor for the Center of WTO Studies in IIFT, and he's on special leave from the WTO Secretariat in Geneva, where of course he was counselor in the accessions division. So he's handled a series of accession negotiations in the WTO, and one of the most seasoned, if I can say, persons in the accession division. And of course he's from the same alma mater to which many of us belong, St. Stephen's College, and then Jawaharlal Nehru University and London School of Economics. Sajal?
A very good morning to all of you. A special thanks to CI and OP Jindal for this invitation and for choosing what I think is a very interesting topic, and of course a good panel to be on, because there are already what I wanted to say, much of what I wanted to say has already been said by the others before me. I'm close to being the last speaker. Srikar has the biggest problem because after I finish, hopefully he'll have something left to say. What I was going to say is that it's also good that Henry was here, because being in a room full of Indians, it's good to have a slightly different perspective. Even though it's from Singapore, right now he's in Singapore, he's wearing a Singapore hat, but he has, of course, talked about China and offered a few anecdotes as well. So I also plan to add a few anecdotes, because I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so I have to speak. And of course, if I do speak, the views will be a bit personal, so don't quote me on that. But I intend to basically cover 4 topics, 4 points in my presentation in the next 18 odd minutes. The first is the journey of China and India in the WTO and the GATT before that. I mean, how has it started? How did they embark on this journey in the GATT and WTO? Where were the points of divergence? Of course, because China rejoined the multilateral system, because they were an original member of the GATT in 1947-48, like India. But while India had an unbroken history in the multilateral trading system, China did have an interval in between, and the rest, of course, is history. Thereafter, because of that, the membership terms in the WTO are different. India is an original WTO member, while China has negotiated its WTO entry in 2001. And what are the implications of that? Henry did mention it a bit, but I'll pick up on those points as well. From that, moving on to the interests and stake in the WTO of both India and China. Where are the commonalities and where are potential points of difference? And finally, what next for India, China, and the WTO, if I have time, of course. So that's what I plan to do. As I just said right now, in 1947, there were 23 contracting parties to the GATT. Both India and China were among them. Okay? Both India and China were not necessarily all very, very gung-ho about the idea of trade opening, about trade liberalization, tariff reductions, tariff rounds. In fact, China post-1949 ceased to be a GATT contracting party. There was a bit of controversy about it, who withdrew, who didn't withdraw, but I won't go into that. But needless to say that China was not part of the room of the GATT contracting party. India remained in the room for whatever reasons. I mean, may not have been the most demanding. It was perhaps more reactive than proactive. In fact, by being in the room, India, perhaps and other developing countries, took a leadership role on many of the so-called special and differential treatment provisions. Starting in the mid-50s, there was a review session where, in fact, the first BOP provisions, S&D provisions on BOP, for example, came into play. And it gave the policy space for developing countries to run the trade policies of the time. The orientation from the 50s to the early 1991 for India has been of import substitution, inward-looking policies. China, till at least the 80s, had the same kind of policies, and then it also changed tracks and looked outwards. So the GATT and the way developing countries like India viewed the GATT was a GATT which gave them policy space to do what they wanted to do in terms of import substitution policies. So the S&D provisions were more about policy space, be it for BOP reasons or others. Okay? And there's a whole part 4 added in the 60s, for example, where India, Brazil, and others took the lead to saying, look, there's both a moral and a political and economic logic to basically help developing countries. The enabling clause came in the 70s at the end of the Tokyo round, and there's a long history of this. But basically what I'm trying to say out here is that India has always been a core GATT participant. Okay? And China had left the system. So it did have that sort of feeling that, okay, it is not yet so well prepared to participate effectively in the WTO when it rejoined it. And it decided to rejoin in the 80s, around the mid-80s, when there were big changes within China. The Chinese reforms started in mid-80s, where special economic zones, the coastal areas, industrial and trade policy was changed on its head. And the rest is, of course, history. For 30 years, China has by far seen the most rapid transformation probably in living history, living memory at least. It has transformed its own economy, and perhaps it's transformed the world as well as a result of that. And as a result, of course, it has seen itself, its share in trade rise remarkably, often displacing others in the way. Okay? Today, it's the world's largest exporter of merchandise products. Today. Okay? And all these things have implications. Now, so therefore the journey of China and India in the GATT started together. It deviated thereafter. India remained in the WTO and the GATT before that. It was an original member of WTO, while China had to rejoin the WTO. Interestingly, while we talk about one China policy, in WTO you have more than one China as members. Okay, you have 4 China policy, as Henry says. Okay, so there's Hong Kong, China, and China Macau, for example, by virtue of being customs territories, were also original members of WTO. So when you talk about WTO being for states or separate customs territories, it does not only apply to the EU, it also applies to China, for that matter. All right? And in fact, Chinese Taipei and China, mainland China, joined together in 2001. All right? Perhaps now on the membership terms in the WTO. Okay, and here we often talk about two things: market access and rules. All right, I'll talk about market access a little later because that also shapes China's current and future position in WTO. Because as a new entrant, a RAM, not a VRAM, but a RAM, it certainly has taken on far more commitments than original members like India have, even though they've been a member of the GATT for 50 odd years and have gone through those trade rounds. It was normally as with the policy space in mind, not about engaging in mind. So therefore, in terms of market access, China's bindings and its commitments, specific commitments and services are far more broader and deeper than India's, even though it's a late entrant to the game. On the rules area as well, China's protocol commitments, its accession package, was different from all other acceding governments. In fact, China's accession was and has always will be one of those unique examples. For example, the protocol of accession, which is normally just a 2-page document with 5 or 6 paragraphs referring to the other commitments in the Working Party report, in China's case ran into 100 pages. It was a separate negotiation in itself. Right? There were many China-specific elements in the accession package of China, which have not been seen since or later. And remember, a protocol commitment, a commitment made by China in its accession, is legally binding. It's enforceable. It's very much a part of the legal text. You know, the legal text which Henry talked about, that solid book which is there, also includes, what is not published, all the goods and services schedule, plus the protocol commitments of each recently acceded member thereafter. Even that's part of the legal text. So for example, there have been recent cases, raw materials for example, where even the protocol commitments are put into play in dispute settlement. So rules, as far as China is concerned, are the legal text plus its own protocol commitments. And here I would say India and China again are different. India, as an original WTO member, had terms as agreed in the Uruguay round. So it was terms what was already negotiated by India as well, because they were also the forefront of the negotiations in the Uruguay round as well. They had trade-offs, TRIPS, GATS for AOA and ATC, for example, textile and clothing, for example, and special and differential treatment when you're taking a single undertaking. So SPS, TBT agreements have special provisions for developing countries, agreement on agriculture, and so on and so forth. So India had terms as agreed in the Uruguay round, while China had terms to be agreed between a negotiation of China and the rest of the membership. And this, of course, through interesting complexities, uniqueness, and specificity to China and China alone. Okay? There are two types of specificities, and I shall just briefly touch upon both. The first is the transitional side of it. You know what I think Henry briefly said, in the first 10 years, China was in the periphery before moving center stage. In fact, China also took on, for a while, transitional sort of commitments. Okay? There was a transitional review mechanism, which was annually every year for 8 years, and then finally, in the 10th year was a final one. Okay? But interestingly, while in 2001, China was not the top 4 traders, today it's the top trader. Okay? So in any case, as far as the TPR is concerned, it has to have a TPR every 2 years. So the transitional mechanism and what is the mechanism in play today is not going to be that different, at least as far as the TPRM is concerned. Having said that, there were other specific measures, like the transitional product-specific safeguard mechanism, which was to be in operation for 12 years from the date of accession. So again, this will be now, is about to be phased out very shortly. Then there was the product-specific, so the special safeguard mechanism for textiles and clothing for 8 years. Now, why were these additional conditionalities added to China's package? It is partly because China itself, as Henry was saying, is a big trading nation. It is, I won't call it elephant, the tiger in the room. I think India is called the elephant. So it is a tiger. And it's definitely a major power as far as manufacturing is concerned. Manufacturers are concerned. Today, everything is made in China. Practically everything is made in China. And having said that, many developing countries, not only developed countries, but many developing countries, for example, Mexico, were interested in their textile exports and clothing exports to the US. So many of these special transitional mechanisms were the result of intense negotiation between China and existing WTO members across the development spectrum. There is no such homogeneity in that sense. And I know that many developing countries also negotiate very hard with China. And at the end of the day, they got some compromise deals. Okay, we'll agree to something more onerous than others, but it will not be in perpetuity. It will be for a limited time period only. Now I'll share an anecdote with Henry as well. Once a Chinese negotiator was in a room like this sharing an experience. It was 2-3 years ago, before Russia joined. He used to say that the Russians always come to the Chinese and say, you gave too much in accession. Okay? You sold out basically and made it much more difficult for everyone else. The Chinese view of the world, and I think this is the wisdom of the Chinese in this sense, is that 10 years is just a blink of the eye. Right? Transitional mechanisms are transitional. In those 10 years that China was in the WTO, Russia was out of the WTO. And if China had to join today and had waited for those 10 years, it would not have been easier. It would perhaps have been much more difficult. So again, I think that the fact that these transitional mechanisms were aberrations at the time, aberrations definitely, but temporary aberrations. And it was in keeping with China of 2001 or 95 for that matter, because it launched its negotiations in the late 80s. Today, if it had to join, perhaps it would have had to do many more hula hoops. Who knows? Okay, because then there would be many more concerns, as China is now even larger than it was then. Because I don't think trade negotiators necessarily have a good future vision. You know, we always look at right now, the most immediate. How do you defend it in Parliament or with the U.S. Congress or whatever? But if you look at anything, you should look at it 5, 10, 15 years down the line. And I don't think even Chinese could have foretold what has happened since. And certainly the rest of the world hadn't. Because in 2001, when the Doha round was launched, it was US and EU for saying, okay, versus the rest. But today it's not like that. I don't think it's going to be like that either, moving forward. Besides the transitional review mechanisms, there were some other things, because China is, of course, a very complex country. They have, of course, a world-class manufacturing sector. It is the biggest exporter, as I mentioned already, a big trading power, a big manufacturing base. But it also has, an agrarian economy, for which a large number of people depend on that sector, for example, and which conditions maybe not be very much different than India's, small holdings, etc. So it is between, in a way, different stools here. In the agriculture sector, for example, perhaps has many of the characteristics of other developing countries like India. While in the manufacturing sector, it may be far ahead of even some of the developed countries, for that matter. Okay? And that's why the terms of accession, the terms to be agreed, also have certain aberrations. To name a few, in the agreement on agriculture, while on domestic support, de minimis levels are either 10% for developing countries and 5% for developed countries, China agreed to 8.5. Okay? Or in the area of, say, subsidies, they revoked, or say they said that they gave away the right to invoke certain S&D provisions in subsidies and countervailing measures as a price to pay for membership. One can always argue about WTO plus and minus and why it's inherently fair or unfair. But that was the price that China paid to be in the room, to have a seat on the negotiating table. And now, looking back, I don't think that price was too high. I don't think that price was too big. I don't think Chinese feel either that way. From there, from rules to market access. And on market access again, okay, original WTO members vis-a-vis newly exceeded or RAMs. Okay, the reason why there's VRAMs, in fact, you can call it RAM minus C or RAM minus CR now. China and Russia, for example. Okay, because what may hold for, say, Tonga may not hold for China. Okay, and again, I'll just read out the numbers for you. Okay, the bindings, and then the applied rates. China's binding in agriculture is about 15.8%. India's is about 115%, because we chose ceiling bindings. China's bindings in non-agricultural products is just under 10, about 9%, 9.1%. India's is 34.5%. China's overall trade tariff bindings in WTO around 10%. India 48%. So the starting point, if now we talk about negotiations, at least as far as tariffs are concerned, China's starting point is different from India's. Moving from bindings to applied rates, the real currency of what actually happens, here the difference is not so large. In agriculture, China's applied rate in agriculture is about 15.5%, while the binding is 15.8. In agriculture, the tariff applied rate is 15.6. So there's a very, very small window of water. Okay. In India, the binding is around 115%, but the applied rate on average, the simple average applied rate, is on average 33.5%. So there's a lot of water. Okay. We have flexibility that they don't, and vice versa. In non-ag, the applied rate of China is 8.7, India's 10.4. Okay, not much difference. So in terms of average applied rates in manufacturing products, India and China are relatively on the same page. But of course, China is certainly very much in the epicenter of global value chains, while India is perhaps on the periphery. And we might like to change that as we go on, all right? Because of trade balance and other issues as well. Again, you can see while China's bound rate is 9.1 in non-ag, and the applied rate is 8.7, again, not much water. So therefore, sectorals do bite. Because sectorals, in this case, would lead to real reductions. Okay. In India, our average binding is 34.5 in non-ag, and 10.4 is the applied rate. So we have almost a multiple of 3.5 to play around with. Right? So these are the kind of differences, which is why China, for example, took steps to join the ITA too. India did not. But perhaps here, it is interesting to say that perhaps China is playing the role that India played in GATT, because China had problems with the product list covered in ITA 2. So while it was party to the ITA 2, its participation was criticized. And they said that, China is excluding many ITA products, which they should include. While India said, we want to stay away. And perhaps, Henry, in a slight deviation from what you said, I think while China, and I understand how China looks at Brazil and India and don't pick on me kind of situation, okay? I see. How much time do I have left, Samantha? 2-3 minutes. I'll try to wrap up. While I do see the logic of what you're saying, that look, China does not want to feel isolated. It sees itself very much as part of the developing country group. But how does the rest of the developing countries look at China? Okay? I'm saying that these are views expressed are personal. They don't represent any official or governmental or intergovernmental position. But I guess out here, if China wants to be on side with other big emerging economies, then it certainly needs to carry them along. Be it in global value chains, be it in the seat of the table. But I think now, as we move forward, I think this is a good way to move forward. I think interest in stake in the WTO, today the way the world seems to be set up right now, it's emerging economies versus the established ones. The established ones have lost interest in WTO, barring EU. Okay? And they're looking at other vehicles, be it TTIP and TPP, etc. Emerging economies have the greatest stake in the multilateral trading system. And I think here, and this is where the commonality comes in, both China, India, Brazil, all have the same common goal and interest in keeping the WTO relevant, in keeping the WTO alive. In fact, what was said earlier about the FTAA, it requires the failure of one of these mega deals to make WTO back in the driver's seat again. And who knows, I think, let's say, aapke muh mein khui shakkar kind of thing. But anyway, but be it as it may. Look, I think, one more thing, yeah. On services, China took on 93 service subsectors. It took commitments in 93 service subsectors with quite a lot of deep commitments. India took commitments in about 37 only. So again, 3 times as much. China decided to apply for TISA, and that has in fact killed TISA, which is great, because I think India also has a big interest in services like China. In fact, if you look at it as the relative share of goods vis-a-vis services, India's services sector is perhaps the dynamic sector. And I know that both Srikar and Sumanto can speak ad nauseum on these matters, so I won't go into that right now. Finally, just to wrap up, what next for India, China, and WTO? I think, as I said just now, mega FTAs may have to fail for WTO to succeed. That is perhaps one way of looking at it. Okay, and I think new times require new leadership. They were talking about Quad, but is there like a Chinese term, the triad, coming up? Okay, and if so, will China insist that it not be a triad but a quad?
Good afternoon. I think Sajal was right. Being the 5th speaker on this illustrious panel is really difficult, and knowing very well that I'm between you and lunch, I'll be cautious with my time, as well as I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'll try to relate my experiences as well as thoughts on this subject. I was just reminded about the argumentative Indian that Sajal spoke about as negotiators, and that set the tone for the India-China context. What I'll do today is, since the whole conference has been about India and China, I thought I'll just stress upon the experiences of India and China in services, the services sector. So I won't be talking about tariffs, RTAs, and all the legal jargon that is connected to the WTO. I'll try to focus on international services negotiations and try to bring out a few strands of comparison in a few areas between India and China. And I'll basically try to compare the Indian and Chinese experiences in the context of, one, how does China use international negotiations as a tool for internal reform? That's one area I'd like to touch upon. Secondly is the ability to implement reforms domestically to face the external sector. How do we see India and China? Thirdly, on this whole concept of experimental liberalization. That is, you don't liberalize whole hog, but kind of calibrate liberalization. How does China fare? How do we look at it? Then, of course, there is this whole debate about state versus market. Role of the state versus the role of the market in liberalization. What's China's experience and how does India look at it? And finally, in dispute settlement and services, a bit of that. So I'll try to have, relate to these 5 areas. And this comparison actually is not to seek an emulation of either. I mean, should India go the China way, or it's just a comparison to look at what motivates these policy moves, and whether we could learn something from it. So as you're well aware, the services sector itself is important in the Indian context. So when we're talking about services, what are we talking about? We're basically talking about, of course, Professor Pant said it's not only about IT, but in the context of India, unfortunately, it is IT. The IT and ITS exports are the major portion of our services exports. But we are looking at other services like tourism, we're looking at healthcare, looking at professional services. So the whole rubric of commercial services, business services, in fact, the WTO has a list of more than 163 services. So, and the trade and services context. Now, if you look at India's position, India has always been a forerunner in the services field, at least in the world economy. And in most of its FTAs, we have very strong services chapters. Mode 4, that is the movement of natural persons, is considered one of our strengths. Even in the WTO, it's one of our basic pillars of our negotiation. And China of late, we see, is also moving. Of course, China is primarily, its strength is in industry and in manufacturers, but is moving towards this role of having a more dominant say in services. So when we compare these the two countries with respect to these 4 or 5 categories, let me first take the category of international negotiations as a tool for internal reform. What I mean by this is that if you look at when you talk about WTO, we talk about GATT, you talk about liberalization, the normal debate is, oh, your sovereignty is being affected, right? Your domestic policy is going to be curtailed, you don't have space. You're going to be, cheaper imported products are going to come in. You don't have a place to maneuver, and hence you have to, you have to fight. I mean, you have to participate in international negotiations to protect your own national interest. And that's the dominant debate even in India in the context of many of its negotiations, where international negotiations are basically seen as some are fait accompli and some are also seen as not in your own interest. But if you look at in the context of services, just a thought about how has China used this? Trying to recollect just some thoughts. China has, I think, tried to use international negotiations to reform its own internal process. So you saw the accession of 2001 exceeded. Now the willingness to join TISA in the trade and services agreement is the next biggest services agreement outside the WTO. Of course, India is not, though India has a strong services economy, it's active in the services. We are not part of TISA, but China has applied for TISA. So the way China, I see China viewing it is that when international negotiations demand that you have to reform your internal sector, it uses the international negotiations to bring about this change. Now, does India do it? Well, India has faced that situation, but does India use it as a policy instrument, international negotiations to reform internally? There are questions because it's not as simple as that. It's not as simple because what is your ability to implement policy reform in both the countries? Let's look at it objectively. It is not a comment again on structures. The ability to implement internal reform, because liberalization is not only about, in services, liberalization is not only about opening up your sectors. Liberalization is about opening up your sector, getting market access outside, but also opening up your own internal sector. So if you want market access for IT outside, your IT policy regime should be open for outsiders to come in. So what is the ability to make that internal reform in both the countries? Now, if I look at it, my way of looking at it is you have to look at the political structure then. In India, and it's election season, so you know the whole chaos of democracy. So India is the largest democracy, and we have, how easy is it to bring about regulatory reform in sectors to open up? There are domestic vested interests, there are industry lobbies, there are even with bureaucracy. So you have, one policy reform might throw up 100 questions. How is it in China? I'm not privy to the internal debate in China, but I would presume that it might be a bit easier for internal reform in China as compared to India. Because there you take a decision, maybe probably much easier to implement. Let me give you an example in the context of services where China recently has gone with the Shanghai free trade zones. Now, the whole approach of China to liberalization has been, for example, the commitments in GATS, 93 sectors open in services, whereas India is 33, and open to foreign players both for market access and national treatment. They have an experiment of the Shanghai free trade zone, wherein in certain areas you're completely liberalized. So it's in services, so financial services, telecommunication services, banking. It's on the negative list approach. It's not a positive list approach. So that means that now let us just take an example in the Indian context. Can we tomorrow decide as a trade policy that we would open up a particular state totally for services liberalization? How would it be viewed politically with party A in state and party B in the central government with a lot of political debate, discussion? Is it as easy as China to have the Shanghai free trade policy, free trade zone, and then implement it in a course of time? So the comparison is a lot of liberalization and commitments that China undertakes is able to implement it in the domestic context, not easily, but comparison to India probably much easier. So I think that context has to be kept in mind, and probably when you look at India and China. And I liked Henry's point when he spoke about China when it joined international negotiations, it shifted its position from being a silent player, but then to a position of practical position with flexibility. Now this is very important in international negotiation. Now international negotiations, we talked about developing countries, China being the friend of developing countries. India takes its position of being the leader for the developing countries in terms of putting your position. But beyond a point, it's just national interest that plays in international negotiations. The US and EU might talk about free trade rules and liberalization for good for the world, but it's always the interests of their industry and interests of their workers, interests of their jobs. So every country looks at its own national interest, its own market interest when it negotiates. And beyond a point, this coalition of developing countries, the coalition whether China, India, Brazil can become a coalition. Well, you have a coalition on many interests, but at the end of the day, China would obviously, from your presentation, would also be looking at their own national interest in these negotiations, and that's a clear take that China has done even in services, where they want to join TISA. They don't want to be out of TISA. They've done aggressive FTA policies. They have an aggressive FTA policy. They've had FTAs with Australia, New Zealand. They're going ahead with EU. So, that's kind of a difference which we see between China and India. And also about, Sajal spoke about vision. Now 10 years is a small time. You have a vision a strategic vision for trade reform. Right? Of course, China might have had a strategic vision for its own economy in terms of liberalization, but a vision has a cost, and every vision has costs. It has domestic costs, it has sectors which will be affected, local employment will be affected. Now, in terms of facing that effect, how will India and China face that effect? Politically, economically. Is it easier in China to face it politically rather than India? So, hence does India stay back from going into that liberalization mode? I think this is some questions that we can see in this whole debate. The other issue between with India and China is the whole role of the state in the market. Now, if you look at WTO and GATT, the assumption is that the market, it's all about the market, it's liberalization, and the role of the state has to reduce. It's liberalization basically is the private sector taking over. There reduce of barriers, but there's a lot of commentary on how in China. Even though China acceded in 2001 with great commitments and it's gone on, state capitalism, as they call it, is very strong in China. And you have the state-owned enterprises in China which control most of the economy, not only in goods but also in services. Now, China has been able to integrate into the global economy, being a great supplier to the entire world, but still maintaining its internal structure of state-led economy or to that extent. So even that's a very interesting example of how you have maintained your own your internal structure but still integrated into the economy. So I think that's one dichotomy between India and China, where India, you don't have the state economy in business as strong as probably in China. The other issue between in China and India in the context of this comparison in services is on subsidies. Now we don't talk about subsidies in services so much because it's not as well established as in goods in terms of the legal framework. But there's a lot of discussion about how both India and China subsidize, the Chinese subsidy policy in land, in land use, in giving incentives. So I think that's an interesting also area to study before India and China. And finally, when you talk about dispute settlement, I think because of the high level of commitments that China has undertaken, I think it's facing a lot of disputes now. So you look at not only the China rare earths case or the export restriction minerals. Even under services, which is a rare commodity in disputes, the China Union pay card, China Cup case, the China Union payment transfer case, which Visa and Mastercard had against the China Union pay card, is also an example where we probably will see more disputes because of commitments undertaken in both the commitments as well as the protocol. And how will China react to it? Will China comply? Will China go? US has lost a lot of cases in the WTO, but it still doesn't comply in many instances. So will it go that way of maneuvering, or is it going to change its domestic reform? So those are interesting cases in this comparison between India and China. But overall, I think if you just to conclude in terms of the services agreement and services sector. If I look at the comparison, what are the lessons probably India could take from China? One lesson is that in terms of using the international negotiation as a platform for domestic reform. That's a very strong message that China does very effectively. Probably that could be one message that we could see. The interplay of your national interest to protect your national interest in international negotiations, probably that could be one lesson. Also, a non-ideological position in many cases, because China, I mean, this is also, since it's a closed room and it's not, many negotiations we come across. The positions taken by Chinese negotiators are not ideological in many senses. Well, we'll expect economy with probably a socialist path of development with the whole planning. But the position in the negotiating room is very much practical in terms of, fine, we're open. What is it is it in our interest? Is it applicable to all? So looking at a practical position with flexibility and taking that call. So whereas does India take that position in all cases? Do we take an ideological position, or do we take a more flexible approach? Can we learn from that? So I think that is one lesson we could learn. And I'll just end with probably one issue that might come up in the context of China, which India might want to watch, is the whole issue of currency wars. This discussion about devaluation, which is doing the rounds. And even today there was a news report about how the US has again raised this issue of China devaluing the currency to make their Chinese exports cheaper. And when you talk about mega regionals, the TPP, also there's a push to have a clause in the TPP on currency undervaluation, where currency undervaluation is actually a subsidy. So China, of course, Brazil has moved that in the WTO, but China's position has been that it doesn't devalue. So this is one area which probably would come up for discussion. So I think probably I'll end with this, just some rambling thoughts without a PowerPoint. I hope I've kept my time, and thank you.
And there are both sides to it. You, on the one hand, you autonomously do what you believe is best in your own national interest, and then you use that as leverage for international trade negotiations. Or the reverse, when you are not in a position to do that, you often have to then fall back upon multilateral and international pressures for you to be able to push domestic reforms. Now, which one is better, which one is worse, I don't intend to pass any policy judgment on that. But at this stage, let me thank the 5 speakers. This is, of course, an enthralling subject, and you could go on and on. I'm reminded of a book by one of my classmates, and of course, a very well-known TV magnate, Raghav Bahl, which is, of course, a comparison between India and China, not so much in a trade context, but much more in the context of how India and China would palm out in the next 10 years. But let me now throw this discussion open to the public. I know that the flavor of lunch is, and the aroma of lunch is somewhere around, but mindful of that, even then I would venture to give 15-20 minutes for discussions, but I would request each sort of speaker to just identify themselves and be please brief about what you would like to address, and you want to address it to a particular panelist. Please feel free to say so. So the floor is open. Please.
I'm Vivek. I'm a master's student in mechanism. Can we expect these issues being addressed in the WTO or then being included in future negotiations of the WTO?
Yeah, some more questions, please. I think then we can take at least 3 or 4 and then ask the panelists to respond.
So James Nadumbara, we have been talking about the policy space here, right? The China policy space. With the transitional mechanism expiring in the near future, what kind of policy space we can expect, mainly with respect to China?
Actually went on Parliament and said on the floor that we need to figure out why we are doing RTAs, we are not getting anything. And I think that's partly what I'm really trying to sort of tell him is, you're looking for the wrong things to get. And I simply said that economic benefits are not the only benefit from RTAs. It is the fact that you need to get into coalitions. Henry, I talked about very similar things from the Chinese point of view. In today's world, when there are more than 2 countries involved in negotiations, you need to get into some group or the other. And RTAs seems as good a way as other. Now, could I get the RTA benefits multilaterally? I think you could, because in any case, if you go carefully into RTOs, in many of the RTAs, many of the areas where you actually could trade more, people work the ROOs, rules of origin, in such a way that actually nothing's to be left. So you really keep out the areas where you really can trade very much, like automobiles in India, ASEAN. So I don't think that the RTAs give you any greater economic benefits than an MTN vote. But they are important for the political reason. I don't know if I've answered the question.
Srikar, would you like to ask a question? Sajal?
On James' question about policy space for China once transitional mechanisms expire. Well, I guess there are two types of transitional mechanisms in China's accession. One which they would like to expire, they would be very happy when it expires, and the other which perhaps maybe less happy. S&D provisions, for example, say the space to implement, say, certain obligations or trips or customer evaluation, but they did by and large most things were much shorter transition which have expired long ago. So WTO is China participates fully in WTO agreements itself. The second type of transitional mechanism, especially the one which I referred to, be it the safeguards, be it the review mechanism, those are perhaps mechanisms which China would be happy to see the back of, if I may put it very simply. And I don't think there are any tears lost in that.
Can I ask, what about the non-market economy?
Yeah, that's it. In fact, I wrote it down. Thanks a lot. Thanks for reminding me, because I didn't talk about it. I think someone did before me or something about China's accession was also unique partly because it was moving. In some ways, it hasn't fully moved either from centrally planned to a market economy status. And in fact, especially in the area of trade, which you're of course a guru of, this is an issue which will always come up in terms of calculations of dumping margins or application of safeguard duties or countervailing duties. The issue of China not being treated as a market economy. In fact, again, an anecdote I'm going to add out here is that for the times of the periphery, when China was still on the periphery and in accession negotiations with other newly acceded members which were in the pipeline, China had one point agenda, basically, and that point was treat us as a market economy. Okay, and some countries have given China treatment of a market economy status, and others haven't, because it is, of course, a quite fairly complex economy. Srikar talked about state's presence, the state sector being predominant. That's not only specific to China, but also to other economies. But I think China, the way pricing is done, pricing policies, state economy, there are, I guess, still some questions asked of how fully has this movement from planned to market economy happened in China, and that's why some countries have not yet taken China market.
Can I ask you a question?
Well, maybe once we after the floor. So,
Hi, good afternoon. Arun sir.
Grounds where you can say there is an issue, but at the same time, many countries, many developing countries also in Africa or Asia, don't have competition laws itself. So then to have a lowest common denominator, as a global competition framework, the government doesn't set the laws, the national laws, they set the framework or the benchmarks from which you can develop your own national laws. So in the absence of competition policy in many countries, is there preparedness for a global competition policy? India, for example, only developed a competition law subsequent to 2009. So now perhaps our preparedness is better than it was then at that point of time. But still there may be some concern.
Oh, thank you.
So the